مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إحدى الحقائق المؤسفة التي تشهدها كل من السياسة الأميركية والعالمية هي صعود التطرف، ومما يزيد من صعوبة هذه الإشكالية إنه يبدو أن هناك تزايداً في كل أنواع التطرف اليميني والتطرف اليساري، وكما رأينا في الشرق الأوسط والأوروبا، بل وحتى هنا في الولايات المتحدة التطرف الإسلامي. ما المقصود بالتطرف اليميني؟ شاهدناه في شارلوتسفيل بولاية فيرجينيا، حيث خرج النازيون وكو كلوكس كلان في مسيرة حاملين الأسلحة ومطلقين التهديدات بحق السود واليهود وكل من يعتقدون أنه لا مكان له في أمريكا البيضاء. ما المقصود بالتطرف اليساري؟ شاهدناه في بيركلي بولاية كاليفورنيا وميدلبري بولاية فيرمونت، حيث منع المحتجون الخطباء من ممارسة حقهم في حرية التعبير بالحرم الجامعي، لأن رسالة الخطباء لم تكن على هواهم. وهنا في أمريكا نعرف كلنا كيف قد يكشف التطرف الإسلامي عن وجهه، كما رأينا في نيويورك وأورلاندو وسان برناردينو. هل التطرف بسبيله للصعود حقا؟ وإلى أي درجة تعود هذه الظاهرة ظاهرة عنيفة؟ وماذا يمكننا نحن الحكومة والمجتمع أن نفعل بشأنها؟ لمناقشة هذه القضية يسرني أن أرحب بواحد من أبرز خبراء واشنطن في مجال سياسة التطرف، وهو سيموس هيوجس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. Today on our show, we're talking about extremism. We've seen all sorts of it in America over the last several weeks and months, and we're going to delve into all those aspects of extremism with our guest, Seymour Hughes. Seymour, thank you very much for joining us. So, first of all, how do we define extremism? What makes something extremist rather than just a little bit of a fringe political view?
Yeah, we look at extremism, at least at the program extremism, as individuals that are trying to advance a political cause. And we particularly focus on individuals that use violence in order to do that. So that could be far right, far left, Islamist extremists. It kind of runs the gamut.
And what percentage of Americans, or how big a group do you think in America constitutes the world of extremists?
Yeah, it's a relatively small number. I mean, you're talking about 1,000 active investigations as it relates to ISIS, the FBI is running, and about 1,000 active investigations for far right and far left extremism. So relatively small in the spectrum of individuals that rise to the level of law enforcement concern. But there's a larger question here, which is kind of the mood music of extremism, right? The individuals who don't necessarily cross a legal threshold or advocate for violence. And we've seen that rise, particularly the use of the internet.
So if you're saying there's about 2,000 total investigations, beyond that, how many sort of passive fellow travelers do you think are there for the various types of extremism we're talking about?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of quantify a number, but you clearly see that just because someone gets arrested, that's kind of the very end of the spectrum. And there's a lot of folks that are building up into that. So in the case of a white supremacist, they have their friends and they were grown up in the movement, they've involved in that, and so the numbers are probably 5 to 10 times after that.
5 to 10 times the 2,000. So we're talking in the low double digits.
Right. Yep.
So let's take a look at the various types of extremism in America. Are they all on the rise, left, right, and Islamist, or are they taking different different routes?
We've seen considerable rise, at least in the far right and Islamist movements in the last few years. The far left has been slowly moving up in the process. But clearly with the rise of ISIS and the so-called caliphate, that has been a driver for a lot of Americans here. And the far right, you've seen a lot of kind of alt-right or mainstream groups kind of rise up too. So we're seeing this dynamic play out. And increasingly, because of the use of the internet, the fact that these individuals have the ability to kind of coalesce online, meet like-minded people, folks that they wouldn't meet in the real world, but are able to kind of connect and organize that way.
And so is the internet transferring this sort of cyber connection into a real world connection? Are they meeting in person, or are they only meeting on the in the cyberspace?
Yeah, I think a great example of that is what happened in Virginia a few months ago with the rally for the statue there. So they organized online, but they came out in force in person. And so they're using the online environment to essentially do logistical support, right? To coalesce and collect and then meet in the real world. And you know, people don't radicalize to violence or radicalize to extremism simply online. There's an in-person recruitment that matters quite a bit, right? So the reason why 24 guys go from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Syria is not because they had the internet there when they also have the internet in Columbus, Ohio. It has to do with this in-person recruitment, right? One person goes over, plants a flag, and gets their friends from the neighborhood to come with them.
All right, so let's take a look at each of these different streams. Extremism of the right,
Yep.
Let's start with that. Who is this? How do they organize? What do they want?
Yep. There's a variety of different ideological movements there, but you have the far right, the white supremacist movement. Like I said, there's about 1,000 active investigations. The FBI has arrested 172 people in the last year alone. They're looking for kind of a state that's entirely white. They're trying to organize around that. And then you have other movements like the sovereign citizen movement, which doesn't believe that they're part of the federal government and should be separate from it. And then you look at the far left, there's kind of a response to the far right. And so we have this reciprocal radicalization happening where each extreme feeds off each other.
So in terms of the far right, what is the difference between a far right and the term that you used in passing a moment ago, the alt-right?
Yeah. It depends on the individual, but the far right, much more extreme in their beliefs. They're very forceful and vocal about the fact that they want an ethno-state, that they're focusing on that. The alt-right, think of it like the guys with suits and ties. They don't wear the uniforms, they don't do the whole thing. Some of them hold relatively mainstream views, others are more fringe. And so the attempt for the alt-right is essentially to make a extreme movement more palatable for a larger audience. And it's a loaded term. So the problem with alt-right is it becomes a catch-all phrase. So if you don't agree with an individual, you consider them alt-right. And this is the problem with extremism in general, is if we don't understand people's views, if we disagree with their views, we find them extreme. And it makes it very hard from a research perspective.
I can see where that is coming from your opening definition.
Yeah.
It seemed like anybody who has a political view,
Yeah.
but the key criterion is the threat of use of violence.
Yeah, the acceptance of the use of violence. They see it as a viable option.
So if you hold totally extreme views, wanting to create a white state, wanting to create an Islamic caliphate in America, but wanting to do it, say, through constitutional means.
Yeah, perfectly legal.
Perfectly legal,
Yes.
but would you call them extremist?
I would, yes. I mean, there's a difference between extremists and violent extremists. But yes, I would call them extremists. They provide essentially the mood music for individuals that look at these extremists and say, these guys aren't getting it done quick enough. And so we need to move to violence in order to implement our goals.
Maybe it's purely impressionistic, so that's why I want to correct this. Attacks by Islamic extremists, the impression is they're one-person, two-person attacks.
Yeah.
Are there deeper conspiracies involved that the public isn't seeing?
No, I mean, for the most part, you're talking about one or two individuals who are drawn to this. Now, that's not to say that there's always a bystander effect when you pull back right? So if you look at the cases, you realize that about 60% of the folks who got arrested, somebody saw something that was concerning but didn't know what to do with it and didn't act on it. And so there is kind of a subset of folks who see something but don't know what to do with it, or there's some kind of tacit approval to it. So yeah, we're talking about ones and twos that commit attacks, but there's also other individuals who know about this.
And with the far-right attacks, are they more group or are they more?
They're much more group. You know, you're just for the way that we set up our system of government and our laws, it's easier for the most part to organize in the far right. You're less likely to be, you cannot be charged with material support to terrorism, which is a legal cause for the U.S. So you have larger numbers of people organizing for these attacks.
Could you explain this point a bit more?
Yeah.
That in a larger conspiracy on the right, the laws are different?
Yeah, so there's something called the Material Support to Terrorism Clause. And so if you want to join ISIS, that's a designated terrorist organization. So the FBI could arrest you for the attempt to drive to the airport to go join ISIS. As opposed to, say, if you're in the far right, there's not a designated terrorist organization that matches up with that. We haven't designated the KKK or the Aryan Brotherhood as domestic terrorism groups. So it doesn't allow FBI to, say, open up a wiretap or insert an informant in a way that they could for Islamist-inspired terrorism. So the laws are very different for each one of them. It means the tools for the law enforcement is much more different.
Are there domestic terrorist groups that are designated as such?
There are not. And there's actually some discussions happening right now at the Department of Justice about whether to make this domestic terrorism list. And it's going to have a whole host of political questions here, right? So who's an extremist? That question you asked originally, who's an extremist? There's going to be kind of a pushback on this. But if you want to have parity when you look at extremism, you're going to have an international terrorism list and a domestic terrorism list.
And just for a moment about the left, there's a, what is this term Antifa?
Antifa, yeah.
What does that mean? What does it refer to, and how substantial is this?
Yeah, anti-fascist. They're individuals who believe that they're standing up for kind of the liberal order of these things. They've been more and more organized in the last few years, increasingly as the far right has been organized. And so they see themselves essentially as a response to that. Don't hesitate to use violence in some cases. Don't see that as necessarily a negative on this. I think it's something to continue to keep watching. And you know, sometimes we look at extremism as only far right and only Islamists, but there's also this far left that's kind of been bubbling up for the last few years, and I think it's something we need to keep an eye on.
I want to ask you before our break about foreign connections to any of these groups. First, in terms of the Islamist groups,
yep.
This is the one it would appear to be most obvious that there are certain types of foreign connections. Of all those 1,000 investigations underway, what percentage do you think have foreign connections?
For the Islamist movements, a good number of them. So the ease of the use of the internet allows for a kid in Indiana to reach out to a guy in Raqqa and ask questions. And in fact, we've seen that. My colleague and I, Alex Hitchens, looked at all of the plots in the U.S., and in at least a third of them, they had a touch point with a bunch of guys in Raqqa who were systematically reaching out to them and encouraging them to commit attacks. And so this, again, this ease of the use of the internet lowers the bar for this foreign connection.
So there's sort of like a call center in Raqqa?
Yeah.
You could call on the internet and get advice on how to undertake attacks?
Yeah, it's as ridiculous as that sounds. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll give you an example. There's a case out of Ohio of a 20-year-old man who reached out to a British citizen named Junaid Hussain and said, you know, I want to come to Raqqa. And Junaid said, it's too hard to come here. What you need to do is kill a military officer. And so Junaid gave him the address of the military officer to kill, gave him a link to a knife to buy on Amazon, and told him exactly what to do in order to upload the video. Now, fortunately, that young man was also talking to an FBI undercover agent, so they were able to roll up the plot. But you had a systematic approach to try to groom these individuals to commit an attack in the name of ISIS.
Fascinating. And is that what makes is the connection to ISIS what makes this actually an act of international terrorism?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. The connection to a designated foreign terrorist organization matters quite a bit for this.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about what government and society can do to combat all these different forms of extremism in just a moment. Our guest today is Seymous Hughes. Seymous is one of America's leading experts on terrorism, homegrown violent extremism, and how to fight these terrible problems. He currently serves as the Deputy Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, here in our nation's capital. Previously, he worked at the National Counterterrorism Center, serving as a lead staffer on U.S. government efforts to implement a national strategy to counter violent extremism. Before that, Seymous served as the Senior Counterterrorism Advisor for the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. A prolific writer and regular media commentator, Seymous has appeared in all the elite media outlets, from the New York Times to 60 Minutes, and has testified before the U.S. Congress on multiple occasions. A graduate of the University of Maryland, he is a recipient of the National Security Council Outstanding Service Award and 2 awards from the director of the National Counterterrorism Center for Outstanding Service. So, Seymous, let's talk then about what government can do. You've worked at some of the key agencies in government to address terrorism and violent extremism. What is government good at in terms of this problem, and what is government less good at?
Yeah, so I spent about 3 years doing community engagement on this issue. So I would go to a mosque and community center talking to Muslim American communities about how to prevent young men and women from joining terrorist organizations. And so to answer your question, we're not particularly good at countering violent extremism. It makes us very uncomfortable. Government, by its nature, doesn't like talking about religion, especially in the U.S. context. You know, we have a free speech, strong belief of that, and so it's very difficult for us. What I would say is we're seeing government increasingly get better at one-on-one interventions. So I have a young man I'm worried about, he's talking about how great ISIS is, or he's talking about how great the far right is. What do I do to bring that kid back into the fold? And so you're going to see an increasing movement from government towards this one-on-one intervention approach.
All right, let's unpack some of this.
Yeah.
First of all, Seymous Hughes walks into a mosque in Cleveland or Detroit.
Yep.
First of all, who is there?
Yeah.
And what do you say?
Yeah, so when I
assume, let me make a leap of assumption, I assume you're not Muslim.
I am not. An white Irish Catholic coming into a mosque talking about terrorism. The reason why I did it, and I usually got invited in, is I'd go up and I'd say, my name is Seymous Hughes. I'm a father of a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old, and I want to talk about safeguarding our kids. And so instead of talking about stats and statistics, you say, X number of people joined ISIS. People's eyes glaze over. What you really need to say is, my name is Seymous Hughes, and let me talk about the story of Burhan Hassan. Burhan Hassan was 3 years old when he left Somalia, spent 4 years in a Kenyan refugee camp, spent his formative years in Minneapolis, wanted to build a better Somalia, thought that Al-Shabaab was the way to do it, in a terrorist group in Somalia, travels there, his mother doesn't know where he's been, disappears with his friends, gets to Somalia and realizes that he has doubts. Al-Shabaab puts a bullet in the back of his head, and his family finds out he's killed by looking at Somali news websites. At some point in the radicalization process of Burhan Hassan, he was reachable. My name is Seymous Hughes, and I want to prevent the next Burhan Hassans in the world. That's a different pitch. And it's a way to kind of partner together with government and communities and say, we need to save these kids from themselves. And we need to figure out a way so I don't have to arrest somebody for 20 years. I can reach that 17-year-old kid, but I can only do it if you help me. And again, that Irish Catholic guy from Prince George's County is not going to be the folk who gets to it. It's going to be that religious leader, that soccer coach, somebody else there. And
so you're talking about a community, what you just described, in a community in Minneapolis. It's not just any American Muslim community. It's an immigrant community. Mm-hmm. Is the story different for a mosque of non-immigrant Americans, just Americans, many of whom were born here, they come from 20 different countries, that they don't have this pull back home?
It depends on the case. I mean, in Somali American communities, it's a little bit more difficult because their experience with law enforcement in their home countries had been very aggressive. And so they're instantly kind of tensed up when somebody from the intelligence community comes in and talks. But no, I find that the story of saving kids is kind of a universal feeling, right? Nobody wants their kid to go to jail or die in Raqqa or things like that. And so it's just a matter of how you do the pitch.
I know it's one of the most difficult things to do is to quantify how many people don't do
Yeah.
terrible things
Yeah.
or don't get radicalized. Do you have any sense of how successful, not just you've been, but
Yeah.
more generally this effort to reach out to communities has been?
I think that's the holy grail. I mean, it's one thing when I used to talk to 300 people at a mosque, but I couldn't be able to tell you whether that was my target demographic, right? I didn't know if I was reaching the right folks. The reason why I think this administration's moving away from broad-based community engagement of 300 people in a mosque towards one-on-one interventions is because they want to be able to quantify whether it works or not.
How do you do a one-on-one intervention?
Yeah,
How do you find the kid at the right moment where he's vulnerable to be stopped?
Yep. First of all, you're not looking for a 100% success rate. 10 to 20% is a win for law enforcement. It means they don't have to put resources against it. It means you save somebody. That's kind of as a baseline, okay. There's a couple ways to do it. What I would recommend is twofold. One is individuals that are nominated from community partners and say, listen, I'm worried about Johnny and Johnny seems a little bit off. Or kind of the conversely, the FBI has a full field investigation on this individual. We have agents that are looking at him and we don't want to arrest him. And that's increasingly happening when it looks at ISIS cases where they're getting younger and younger. So the FBI does not want to arrest a 15-year-old kid for material support to terrorism. And they also don't want to watch a 15-year-old kid until he turns 18. And so we have to figure out that non-law enforcement way to address these issues, this radicalization process, in a way that makes sense.
Usually when one gets into one of these cases, is there something else going on? Something in the family, something with a boyfriend or girlfriend? Is there something else?
Yeah, there's a whole host of reasons why. I mean, humans by their very nature are complex, right? And the reason we join extremist groups is varied. But there is a sense of, there's essentially a cognitive opening, whether it be a death in the family, things are happening at home, all of those things that kind of where an extremist kind of ideology can kind of plug its way in. There's also, when you look back at the cases of, particularly in ISIS, you have this sense of wanting to be bigger than themselves, or what does it mean to be Muslim and American, and how does that kind of identity play out? And so this cocktail of grievances and beliefs kind of all mixed together depending on the person.
I should have asked this earlier on. I assume most of the people we're talking about are young men, but I assume there are also young women involved as well.
Yeah, so we've had about 90% of the ISIS cases are men, but we have seen an uptick in women joining, or at least attempting to join terrorist organizations. Now, sometimes they take different roles than men. They play as facilitators and things like that. But no, yeah, I mean, and actually, just recently, ISIS has called for women to join the movement in a much more violent way than they had in the past. And so we're going to see this kind of continue on.
Now, how about government and societal responses to the far right?
Yeah. We've seen, actually, with the far right, we've had kind of a track record for countering violent extremism, meaning that for state and local law enforcement, they have done interventions for 20 years. And a great example of that is, an organization out of Chicago, a former white supremacist who knock on the door of a kid and say, hey kid, I was you 20 years ago, knock it off, and this is why you shouldn't do this. And so in many ways, the approach for the far right is normalizing the approach we've always done for far right, which is not necessarily always an arrest. It's kind of a different approach for these things. To be fair, this administration, and the last one too, hasn't focused a good amount of resources on the far right or even the far left. It's primarily been focused on Islamist-inspired terrorism.
Seamus Hughes, thank you very much for the sobering conversation on extremism in America.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول صعود التطرف في بلدكم، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.